The astute will notice that we're skipping a few verses at the end of chapter 20. This passage today was supposed to kind of cover all that, but as I looked at those verses and as I looked at these next 4 verses that we're also covering, these 4 are packed. I mean, the other however many there are, have some application for us, but they're about, Jesus is saying, see these religious guys, the Pharisees, they love to wear their long robes, they love to stand out in the middle of people, be at the center of attention, sit at the best seats at the table. I don't think we have so much of a problem with I don't think anybody in here struggles with going around everybody else going, aren't I religious? Right? Does anybody have that problem? Check me out, right? The religious leaders back then were like, they were the rock stars. Everybody wanted to be one of them, and so they were kind of at the center of culture, and everybody liked to look at them and go, man, that guy's awesome. I want to be like him someday. Today, not so much. We Christians are kind of pushed out to the fringes of culture, and so I don't think we have that problem so much. There is application there. Go and read it and let God speak to you. But I'm just going to focus on these first 4 verses of chapter 21. I put my phone in the wrong pocket here. Because they are packed with us. And by the way, I want today to be kind of a conversation. I'm going to be asking some questions, and so let's not do the Lutheran thing, and when I ask a question, just sit there, and it's not hypothetical, and I'd love some feedback, okay? But I'm just going to read through these first 4 verses first. Jesus looked up and saw the rich putting their gifts into the offering box. Our offering box is right back there, by the way, just so you know. And he saw a poor widow put in 2 small copper coins. And he said, truly I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all of them. For they all contributed out of their abundance, but she, out of her poverty, put in all that she had to live on. And we're going to stop right there. This is pretty simple to understand, right? The surface meaning is what? What's Jesus' point? Here's one of these questions.
She gave all she had, and that was more than a portion of what they had.
Yeah, she gave all that she had, and that was more than a portion of what they had. And what did you say, Michael? Give generously. It's an easy point. So much of the Bible is actually really, really easy for us to understand. It's really easy. You don't have to go to seminary. You don't have to know the Greek. A lot of it is just right there spelled out. Our problem is taking what we've learned and applying it. We love to learn stuff and love to hear about the cultural context and the Greek and go, oh yeah, that's really interesting. Teach me more. Before we've put what we just heard into practice. So let's dig into this and look at what it looks like to put this into practice. Is this really loud? By the way, it seems loud up here. Nobody's feeling like it's too loud? Okay, good. Give generously. Did Jesus care about the amount that was given? Was he impressed with the amount? It's 2 pennies, right? It was nothing. When we measure on human terms, she gave nothing. So God's not impressed with the amount. He's impressed with her generosity, with her heart. So what God is looking for, the obvious point is for us to be generous people, right? This doesn't just apply to money. What are some other things that we can be generous with or stingy with? Time. Wow, everybody said time. How many of you feel like you just don't have a whole lot of time in your schedule? I think busyness is one of the plagues of our culture, seriously. It used to be that the saying was, idle hands are the devil's tools. I think in our culture, it's busy hands are the devil's tools. I really do. God works through us as individuals. And when we're too busy to connect with our neighbors and our coworkers, not much is going to happen, which is why we need to take a good look at our time. And we need to be generous to God, and as He asks us, be generous with other people with our time. And that might mean chopping some things out of the schedule for the sake of the kingdom, right? Everybody said time. That's crazy. It's not surprising, though. What are some other things we can be generous with? Talents. Love. Forgiveness. So here's one thing we don't often think about when it comes to the topic of generosity, but it absolutely applies. It fits in with what PJ said, forgiveness. And that is our attitude towards other people. Our attitude towards certain people, our love towards certain people. Do you have somebody in your life that gets under your skin? Everybody laughed. That's Lutheran for yes. Do Do you have somebody in your life that you find it hard to have a good attitude towards? And maybe you've given up on having... Did you just point at Brock? That was awesome. Me too, man. We might have somebody in our life that we just find them annoying. We're petty towards them. Something they do we don't like. Maybe it's not pettiness. Maybe they disagree very strongly with us on something that we find very important. And we find it very hard to have a good attitude towards them. Sometimes the difficulty in having a good attitude is due to us being petty and selfish. Sometimes it's due to the fact that they really are being difficult. Some of you have family members that treat you pretty badly. I know some of your stories. And maybe some of you have family members that treat you badly and I don't know about it. But some of you have family who really, they wrong you. So having a good attitude towards them doesn't mean God's expecting you to have warm fuzzies toward them, right? And want to spend all your time with them. That's not what having a good attitude towards them means. But it means if they were to come to you and say, I'm really, really sorry for the way I've been treating you. I repent of that. Will you forgive me? Then you would say yes. And maybe that would also require God working a miracle in your heart, being willing to say, yes, I'm going to forgive them. But until then, it's also being willing to have hope for them and pray for them that God might do something in their heart. So having a good attitude, having love, being generous towards them with your heart means not giving up on them, means not hating them, or means not just being irritated with them. And that's difficult. Generosity, by the way, is usually difficult. It's usually not easy. All these rich people gave a little bit. It was no problem for them. This woman gave all that she had. That's difficult. That's sacrifice. Generosity is sacrifice. And with our attitudes, that can be really difficult especially. But it's something we're called to be generous with. All right? So we're called to be generous people, and we can get fixated on the amount. God is looking for what's going on in our heart, right? When we get fixated on the amount, some bad things can happen. First of all, one of the things that can happen is we might get jealous. We go, that guy's got millions of dollars and he just gave this huge generous gift, and I wish I had that much money to give, because if I had that much money, I would be really generous. I wouldn't give 25 like that guy gave, 25,000. I'd give 100,000. You know? Or I wish that I had that girl's abilities. I'd give so much if I had that girl's abilities. And we can feel kind of jealous, like, God, why didn't you give me stuff? Because you know I'd be generous with it if you gave it to me, right? And that can happen if we get fixated on the amount. But something else that I think is maybe more damaging when we fixate on the amount of a money or ability or wisdom or whatever that we perceive somebody else to have and us not to have, is that we can get this feeling of inadequacy. Like, I wish I had more to give. I talked about this a couple of weeks ago, this sense of inadequacy. Because I don't have very much to give, therefore, God's not going to do very much through me. Right? That's kind of the feeling that we can get. God's going to do the important stuff through other people who have more to give. And if you've ever felt that, then here's kind of what you're believing about God. You're believing that God is up there and He's going, I've got these ideas, got these plans and these initiatives, and I want to make them happen, but I need some resources. I don't have the resources to pull them off. And then I've got this guy over here who's got millions of dollars, but he's not giving any to me. He's spending it all on his condo in Cozumel or something. And then this girl over here, she's loaded with talent. She's got more talent than she knows what to do with. She's got exactly the talent that I need to pull off this one plan that I want to do, but she's using her talent on herself. But then there's this sorry sap over here who, he's trying to give, but he just doesn't have very much to give, and I just can't work with that. I wish I could, and he's just trying to bless me, bless his heart. It's just not enough. I wish these two guys would pony up. I mean, I created the entire universe out of nothing just with my voice, but in order to carry off these plans, these two people have got to start giving me some resources. Otherwise, my hands are tied. And you don't actually believe that about God, right? If we believe that God can't do something big through us, important through us, then we're fixated on the amount. We think God needs our stuff. He doesn't need our stuff. And I think one of the best stories to help illustrate that, one of the best events in the Bible, it's actually recorded in all 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, is what we call the feeding of the 5,000. Jesus is out on a hillside, and he's teaching these people, and it says that there were 5,000, it just says there were 5,000 men. Sorry, ladies. It specifically even says, besides women and children. Y'all didn't count. We love you. You count now, okay? We wouldn't be here without you. But Jesus is preaching to probably 15 to 20,000 people. And he must have been a really good speaker because everybody's sticking around, and the day is wearing on, and eventually the disciples go up to him and say, hey, it's kind of getting late. These guys are probably all getting hungry. You should probably send them home to get something to eat. Since Jesus probably, creator of the universe, didn't think of that. So Jesus goes, well, how about you give them something to eat? So I think they looked around at a sea of 15,000 people, and they looked at each other and then went, what's this guy smoking? And they went, sorry, Jesus, we forgot our food trucks. I mean, it's a nice idea, but actually what one of them says is it would cost half a year's wages to just buy enough bread to feed all these people. But we can go and do that if you like. They actually say that. The disciples are kind of slow to learn, right? Just like we are. They've seen Jesus do some pretty cool stuff, but they're still going, what are you talking about? There's 15,000 people here. And so Peter shows up. Peter's the guy who's impulsive. Stuff comes out of his mouth later that makes him look like a fool, just kind of like us, right? And Peter brings up this kid who had brought his lunch, and I don't think Peter was having a whole lot of faith here. I think Peter was maybe being a little snarky. The Bible doesn't say that he was, but Peter goes, hey, Jesus, I can play this game. I found this kid. He's got 2 whole fish and 5 whole loaves of bread. Problem solved, right? But I think the kid was going, yeah, you can have it. It's not much, but here, it's yours. Jesus said it's important to become like little children. Unless you become like little children, you'll never enter the kingdom of God. So I think this kid was going, sure, will this help? So Jesus goes, I can work with that. So he takes this kid's lunch and he starts breaking it into pieces. And every time he breaks something in half, the 2 halves that he winds up with are just as big as the whole piece that he started with. They're not getting any smaller. And this keeps happening and happening, and it says that he got the disciples involved. So the disciples are going, great, I hate it when he does this. Makes us look like jackwagons. So they're distributing all this food to all these people. And everybody's eating, and everybody has enough. In fact, there's more than enough. And I love this little detail that's recorded in all 4 accounts for us. Jesus says to the disciples, he goes, hey boys, how about y'all go and collect the leftovers, right? And they're like, we get the point, come on. So they go and they collect all the leftovers. How many disciples are there? It's 12 disciples. You know how many basketfuls of leftovers there were? Exactly 12. Jesus makes enough food, I think knowingly, that there's enough to feed everybody, exactly the amount they're going to eat, and then enough that there would be exactly 12 basketfuls of leftovers. Jesus goes, oops, how did that happen? That was an accident. There's 1 basketful of leftovers for each disciple. And 1 basketful of I told you so for each of them to take home and put in their house and sit on their floor and stare at them and remind them that Jesus doesn't need your stuff. He's not dependent on your amount. He's not dependent on how little or how much you feel like you have to give. He just wants you to be generous with what you've got. You know what he really wants is you. That's what he wants. And when he's got you, when he's got all of you, then he's got all your stuff too. Romans 12:1 and 2 talks about it like this. It should be up here on the screen. It says, therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, let me step out of the way. In view of God's mercy, offer yourselves as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God, for this is your true and proper worship. So let me step through this verse real quick. Verse 1. In view of God's mercy, offer your bodies as living sacrifices. What's God's mercy? God's mercy is anything good that we get from him, let alone that he gives us all the treasures of heaven and himself. God's mercy is God's generosity towards us, his overflowing generosity. And from him, instead of death, even though we earned it, we get life. And not just more of the same kind of life that we're experiencing now, but a new and higher order of life that lasts for all of eternity. Instead of chaos, we get peace that passes understanding. Instead of sadness and brokenness, we get overflowing joy and healing. And this cost him very dearly to be able to offer us this. It cost him sacrificing his son. And it's interesting to me that as Jesus is talking about this widow, it's less than 48 hours before he's going to go and sacrifice himself. Less than 48 hours before he's going to go to the cross and suffer horribly. If I were in his shoes and I knew this was coming, I'd be curled up in fetal position somewhere, sucking on my thumb. He's not thinking about that. He's thinking about this widow. He's looking at her heart, looking at her generosity and her sacrifice and going, I get that. That's what I'm about to go do. In view of God's sacrifice, his generosity, be generous. That's what this says. In view of God's mercy, offer yourselves as a sacrifice. In view of him, his generosity, be generous. This is your true and proper worship. We have reduced worship so much in our culture. And the church has been part of that by saying, we're going to worship now, and that always means somebody's going to come out with a guitar and sing. And so worship has become just singing. Or maybe worship has become just in view of God's sacrifice and all that made available to you, offer an hour and a half, maybe every Sunday, maybe every other Sunday. That's actually kind of become the new norm in America. Is every other Sunday, that's considered regular worship attendance. And that's our response. Maybe we'll squeeze in a couple of prayers during the week and a reading here and there. That's become our response to God's sacrifice. That's not true and proper worship. Proper worship is, wow, God, I cannot believe what you have made available to me. I know what I've deserved. I know what I've earned and bought for myself. But I see what you got for me instead and what you've offered me instead. And the only reasonable response is to say, God, all that I have is yours. Because anything that you might ask me to give up is nothing compared to what you've already given me. That's our response when we're really seeing things clearly. And when we're not seeing things clearly, then we're not generous. This is what's at the heart of generosity. Generosity isn't, you better go and be generous or I'm going to smite you. Right? That's not generosity. That's not why we're generous. We're generous because we're looking at what God has given us and gone, man, I am rich. No matter what God asks me to give up, I'm still filthy rich. And what can I give? Just as a reflection of this. When we forget what God has given, that's when we're not generous. When we start to value our stuff more than what God offers us, that's when we're not generous. There's only one time in the Bible that we're invited to test God. Lots of times the Bible talks about testing God and it says, don't do it, don't test him. But there's one place in Malachi where God says, here's something you can test me on, and it's about this issue of generosity. What has happened is that the Israelites have wandered from God again, and God is stepping through some things and saying, here are some things that you are doing that are symptoms of the fact that I don't have your heart anymore. One of them is that you're robbing me. So they say, how have we robbed you? How will a mere mortal rob God? Yet you rob me. But you ask, how are we robbing you? And God says, in tithes and in offerings. Then he says, in verse 9, let's skip to, because of this, their whole land is under a curse. But verse 10 says, bring the whole tithe into the storehouse, that there may be food in my house. Test me in this. Be generous. Test me and find out whether or not I will throw open the floodgates of heaven and pour out more blessing than you can contain. It's in this issue of generosity, and this issue only, that God invites us to test him. Romans 12:2, we just read Romans 12:1. Romans 12:2 says, once you have offered yourselves as a sacrifice, then you get transformed, and then you can test and approve what God's will is. In other words, you go from just kind of reading about God's will and hearing about God's will to actually sort of trying it on for size. And you experience God's will. You find out through experience that yes, it is good and pleasing and perfect. I don't know if we've got it up there. It's good, pleasing, and perfect will. It's kind of like the difference between How many of you have heard about Torchy's queso? How many of you have heard that it's the best thing you'll ever put in your mouth? Maybe aside from Girl Scout cookies. It's that season right now. It's really, really good, right? But it's the difference between hearing about that and actually going to Torchy's and saying, I would like to receive some of this queso, and then you eat it, and then you find out through experience, now you've tested and approved that yes, it is in fact good and pleasing and perfect. That's kind of what this is like. You've heard about the will of God, you've heard that it's good, but until you offer yourself as a sacrifice in view of His sacrifice, you don't find out through experience. You don't get to test and approve that it is actually good and pleasing and perfect. When you say to God, here I am, all of me, like the song says, take my life, it's all for thee, then you find out experientially that God's will is good and pleasing and perfect. So you may feel like you don't have much to give. Don't listen to any ideas that pop in your mind that means that God's not going to do anything important through you. Okay? This widow, first of all, she's lost everything. She's lost her husband, and she's very poor, which means that if she had kids, then they were either very young, too young to earn any money, which means now she's a single mom who's lost her husband, single mom trying to raise her kids on very small income. Or she had kids that have grown up and now are estranged, or she didn't have kids at all. Whatever the case, she's alone, she's struggling, she has nothing on human standards, but we can judge from her response that she has got a good view of God's mercy towards her. Because she's saying, God, here, this is yours. It's the only true and proper response to everything that you have given me. And I don't think that when she woke up on this particular day, I don't think this day felt different. I don't think she felt like she was going to go out and do anything big. I think it was just a normal day, right? She didn't spring out of bed and shout Carpe Diem as she left the door. And her coming to the temple was not announced with trumpets and fanfares and choirs of angels. I don't think she felt like anything big was happening. So as this poor widow is offering her 2 pennies, the creator of the universe happened to be standing right there in human form, watching what was going on. And he looks at her, he sees what's going on, and he says to the people around him, he goes, see that widow over there? See that lady over there? And they go, you mean that shabby-looking widow? And he goes, yeah. Isn't she awesome? Check out that heart. You should try to be like her. And so he keeps saying that to us for the next 2,000 years. Every time anybody opens up to Luke 21, the creator of the universe has continued over 2,000 years to speak to every person reading those pages, to every Christian, every non-Christian, everybody that reads those. He said, see that woman, that poor widow? You should try to be like her and her 2 pennies. We should try to be like her. We should read about her. We should look at her heart. We should look at what else God has to say about that heart and what drives that kind of heart, and be generous people, and then be amazed at what God does through us. We can test and approve that God's will is good and pleasing and perfect, and watch God multiply what you've got, even if it's only 2 fish and 5 loaves, and feed 15, 20,000 people and way more. So let's be generous people, all right?